Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 356. And this time I'm going to talk about this record made by Gerry Mulligan and Thelonious Monk from 1957 on Riverside called Mulligan Meets Monk. This is a 1959 second pressing, I think, mono. You can tell it's a second pressing because it actually has the photo of Gerry and Monk on the cover, which the first pressing does not. This record is a collaboration and the only collaboration between two giants of 1950s jazz. They were both prolific composers and both had made really distinct and original contributions to jazz, but their styles are very different. Mulligan is much more melodic and Monk is essentially kind of unpredictable. Monk was a piano player who could hear and imagine musical lines that would sometimes flummox other performers, and in particular, some horn players found it hard to play with him. So it's not totally self-evident that this record would actually work. Does it? Well, that's the question to be answered. If jazz, and particularly that subset of jazz in the late 40s and early 50s called bebop, is what one might call musician's music, then Thelonious Monk is probably the archetypal musician's musician. In the late 40s and early 50s, the more his stature as a composer and a performer grew amongst his peers, the less the public seemed to take note. His playing is often challenging, at least by 1950s standards, sometimes even jarring. He takes you places as a listener that you don't think are going to work, and then somehow manages to make something as beautiful as it is unexpected. And so, prior to the emergence of really challenging players like Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy, Monk was probably in the 50s the most difficult performer on the whole New York jazz scene, but nonetheless was widely admired by his peers. When I reviewed his record Brilliant Corners a couple of years ago, I talked about Monk's origins, I talked about his status as a bebop revolutionary, and about the fact that Blue Note Records, in a period of really lean success for Monk, championed his music in the early 1950s. And those weren't great years for Monk. He had his cabaret card, which allowed you to perform in New York clubs, taken away arbitrarily by the New York Police Department for refusing to testify against Bud Powell in a drug case. And so the years 1952 to 1955 are, to a degree, his wilderness years. He's not able to play in Manhattan. He can play in Brooklyn. He has friends who arrange dates from there. In this period, he also travels to Paris and he meets his great benefactor, Baroness Nika, who follows him back to New York and basically acts as a buffer between him and cruel reality for pretty much the rest of his career. I told that story in the Brilliant Corners video. In this period, he's also recording for Prestige Records. He's not getting paid much money by Bob Weinstock, the owner of Prestige. He makes some great music. There was the Bags Groove sessions and lots of other great records he puts out, but they don't do that well commercially. And so in 1955, Orrin Cape News of Riverside is able to buy out his contract from Bob Weinstock for a little over $100. Even accounting for inflation, that seems incredibly low. And one can only imagine that by 1955, Weinstock saw him as a kind of a liability, particularly as his performance ban meant that he was still kind of out of sight, out of mind for the influential New York critics. When he moves to Riverside, the early part of his recording career there is not that auspicious. He makes a couple of records which are intended to be commercial big sellers, but both of them kind of flop. And eventually Cape News says, no, you are who you are, record the music that you want to record. That leads to Brilliant Corners, which is kind of the launch of his commercial renaissance in the latter part of the 1950s. Ironically, that record, Brilliant Corners, which put him back on the map, is actually full of some of the most challenging music that Monk ever wrote and recorded. So why was it successful when he was writing challenging music 7 or 8 years before and it was essentially sucking wind? For me, it's a question of timing, and if you'll forgive me a little bit of theorizing here, there was a lot of social change in the United States in the decades after the war, but that sort of momentum for social change had not really coalesced by about 1950. At that point, there had been 15 years of depression and war, and you could argue that the public, music buyers, were not really ready to have their apple cart turned over. But by the mid-1950s, different things were bubbling. There was a new generation kind of taking hold artistically. There were lots of things happening socially, in particular the determination of white Southerners to continue effectively apartheid rule was meeting with a lot of resistance, and musicians, particularly black jazz musicians, were a big part of trying to challenge the status quo in every way that they could. In doing so, it's likely they encountered a record buying public that was more ready to have its foundation shaken than they were a few years before. So in other words, my theory is that by 1955-56, Monk's time had come. Jazz was to be the soundtrack for social change in the United States over basically the next decade, and Monk's playing fit the times. Whatever you think of that theory, Monk's Riverside period clearly marks the resuscitation of his career. His cabaret card was soon restored, and in 1957 he embarks on this now legendary run for 6 months at the Five Spot Cafe with another musician who was seeking a bit of redemption, John Coltrane. Monk's partner on this record was also no stranger to the need for career resuscitation. Gerry Mulligan had originally made his name in New York, working with Claude Thornhill and his orchestra as an arranger, and then he'd fallen in with Miles Davis and Gil Evans, and all that led to the substantial contribution he made to the birth of the Cool sessions. He'd then gone out to LA and reinvented himself as a performer, and his quartet with Chet Baker and Chico Hamilton did so much to define the so-called West Coast cool sound. But at the peak of his newfound fame, when he and Baker are selling tons of records, he gets busted. And when he finishes doing his 6-month stretch, when he gets out, Baker's moved on to other things. Mulligan eventually relocates back to New York, and for the next few years, he regularly performs in quartets, leading his own quartets, albeit with constantly changing personnel. There are a few people who make regular appearances, people like Bob Brookmeyer, but for the most part, Mulligan never really settled with the same lineup for long, and you can see this in his recorded output. Of the 20-odd records that he makes between 1955 and 1960 as a leader or a co-leader, only a handful are made with his own combo. 3/4 of them are basically all-star one-offs, including several Mulligan meets so-and-so records. And in the summer of 1957, with Monk having been reborn in the critical eye thanks to his work with Coltrane at the Five Spot, Riverside Records figured it was time for Mulligan to meet Monk. This record is made over 2 days, August 12th and 13th, 1957, at Reeves Sound Studios in New York City. Orrin Keepnews inevitably is the producer, and Jack Higgins is the recording engineer, and he does an excellent job. All 4 instruments are captured wonderfully, very intimately, and this is generally just a beautifully recorded record. Mulligan, of course, is on the baritone sax, and Monk is playing the piano. Now, I mentioned that Monk was in the midst of a 6-month run. He just started it, actually, at the Five Spot with Coltrane in a quartet setting, and the other 2 members of the quartet are on this record as well. The first is Wilbur Ware, the bassist, and in the late 50s, he was to Riverside kind of what Paul Chambers was to Blue Note, and that he was a regular session guy, reliable player on numerous releases. And for a couple of years, too, he was also regularly part of Monk's club setup. The drummer, Shadow Wilson, had been around really since the heyday of the big bands, and in fact, his recording career goes back to before World War II. He'd played with people like Lionel Hampton, like Woody Herman, like Count Basie, and like Ware, he'd recently become part of Monk's performing quartet. Sadly, this is one of the last records that he's on. In a couple of years, he would die of meningitis at the age of 39. Most of the compositions on here are Monk compositions, and the first track on side 1 is perhaps the Monk composition, Around Midnight. This is one of the most exciting versions of this classic track. I'd mentioned that Monk's comping under other people's solos was occasionally challenging. Miles and Monk famously had fallen out over this issue during the recording of Bag's Groove. Ernie Henry really struggled during the recording of Brilliant Corners, but Mulligan seems to revel in rising to the challenge, perhaps because when he played with Chet Baker, he was used to sort of playing interwoven lines and not just having everybody sort of mellow out underneath his soloing. Anyway, they weave together beautifully on this track. The next track is another Monk track, Rhythmaning. Now, this is the second time that Monk had recorded this, actually, in 3 months. He'd previously recorded it with Art Blakey in May of that year. The final track on side 1, Sweet and Lovely, is a pre-war standard, and this really gets the Monk treatment. If you listen to the original, this is, I guess, a semi-faithful rendition of the melody, Mulligan at least. Monk is pulling at the edge of the fabric all of the way through this track. Side 2 kicks off with Decidedly, which is pure melodic Mulligan. And actually, when Mulligan is stating the theme, it's kind of amusing to hear Monk kind of stalking around the edges of the track, planning his attack. The next track is another Monk classic, Straight No Chaser, and here Monk is really reaching back in his songbook. It's such an interesting melody, this one, because it's basically Monk playing with the same idea kind of over and over, a bit like Coltrane does on Love Supreme, but it inspires one of the most inventive solos that Mulligan offers on the record. The last track is also a Monk track, I Mean You, and here Monk is in a particularly percussive mood. He stamps his authority on the music, but as usual, it's the contrast with Gerry's cheerful melodies that makes the track. This is an amazing record, which appeals in a way which is sort of atypical for 1950s jazz. I don't want to say it doesn't swing, it does swing, but that's not really the basis of the appeal. Instead, what sticks in your head is the challenge of these 2 very different musicians working together to try to bring each of these tracks alive and audibly feeding off each other all the way through. It leads in particular to some unique versions of well-loved Monk numbers. It's endlessly fascinating, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.